May 7, 1945, the day Nazi Germany surrendered should have marked the end of suffering. But for 8-year-old Gisela Schmidt, huddled in the rubble of what was once her family's apartment in Frankfurt, it merely signaled the beginning of a different kind of nightmare. The child pressed herself against a broken wall, her hollow cheeks and skeletal frame testament to months of starvation. Around her, the city smoldered in ruins, and the acrid smell of smoke mixed with death hung heavy in the spring air. Sergeant Robert Miller of the 1st Infantry Division had witnessed horrors that would haunt him forever: the beaches of Normandy, the forests of the Ardennes, the liberation of concentration camps, but nothing prepared him for the sight of German children scavenging through garbage like feral animals. The 26-year-old farm boy from Iowa had been raised to believe in right and wrong, good and evil, but the reality of occupation duty shattered such simple categories. On a patrol through Frankfurt's devastated streets in early June of 1945, Miller first encountered Gisela. She was attempting to steal a discarded tin can from a pile of American military refuse, her tiny fingers bleeding as she cut them on the sharp metal edges. When she saw the tall American soldier approaching, terror flashed across her face. She had been taught that the Americans were monsters, just as she had been taught that Germany would win the war. Both lessons had proven catastrophically wrong. Miller stopped, his rifle slung across his shoulder, and slowly reached into his field pack. The child flinched, expecting violence, but instead he produced a chocolate bear, a precious commodity that soldiers hoarded jealously. He placed it on a piece of broken concrete and stepped back, gesturing for her to take it. Gisela stared at the offering as if it were a hallucination, then lunged forward with the desperate speed of the starving, cramming the chocolate into her mouth so quickly she nearly choked. According to reports from the United States Army Center of Military History, American forces occupying Germany faced strict non-fraternization policies intended to prevent soldiers from sympathizing with the enemy population. These regulations, implemented in the immediate aftermath of the war, explicitly forbade American military personnel from socializing with German civilians, offering them assistance, or engaging in any friendly conduct. Violations could result in court-martial and imprisonment. Miller knew the rules. Every soldier had been briefed repeatedly. No fraternization, no aid to German civilians, no exceptions. The official position, as articulated by Supreme Allied Commander Dwight Eisenhower, held that Germans collectively bore responsibility for the war and must face its consequences without American sympathy. Yet standing before this starving child whose only crime had been to be born in the wrong country at the wrong time, Miller felt the regulations crumble against the wall of his conscience. He began returning to that same street corner every few days, always bringing some thin crackers, canned meat, dried fruit, whatever he could discreetly pocket from the mess hall or trade for with other soldiers. Gisela would be waiting, and gradually her terror transformed into cautious trust. Through broken German phrases and gestures, Miller learned her story. Her father had been killed on the Eastern Front in 1943. Her mother died during an Allied bombing raid in February of 1945, and her younger brother had succumbed to typhus just weeks before the surrender. The child lived in the ruins with a loose collection of other orphans, sleeping in basements and bombed-out buildings, constantly moving to avoid both Soviet soldiers in the eastern sector and German criminal gangs that preyed on the vulnerable. She was utterly, completely alone in a destroyed world, and despite every regulation, every briefing, every order he had received, Robert Miller could not walk away. July of 1945 brought suffocating heat to the ruins of Frankfurt, and with it, the harsh reality of post-war occupation settled over Germany like a shroud. The city, once a thriving financial center, now existed as a landscape of skeletal buildings and mountains of rubble. The German population, reduced to near starvation by the Allied blockade and the complete collapse of the economy, wandered the streets like ghosts. For children like Gisela Schmidt, each day became a battle for survival that made the war itself seem almost a distant memory. Sergeant Miller's clandestine meetings with Gisela had evolved into a routine that required careful planning and deception. He would volunteer for extra patrol duties, taking routes that brought him near her hiding places. He became expert at pilfering food, slipping extra portions into his pockets during meals, trading cigarettes for canned goods, even bartering his own rations to ensure he had enough to share. His buddies noticed his weight loss and assumed he was suffering from stress or illness. None suspected the truth. The non-fraternization policy remained strictly enforced throughout the summer of 1945. Military police actively patrolled for violations, and soldiers caught speaking to German civilians faced immediate disciplinary action. Miller witnessed a fellow sergeant from 2nd Battalion receive 30 days in the stockade simply for giving directions to an elderly German woman. The message was clear. Germans were the enemy, regardless of age or circumstance, and any soldier who forgot this would face severe consequences. Despite the risks, Miller's commitment deepened. He discovered that Ghazala had been an exceptional student before the war, speaking some English she had learned in school. During their brief encounters, she would whisper English phrases she remembered, and he would correct her pronunciation, creating an unlikely language lesson amid the ruins. She told him about her life before: piano lessons, family holidays in the Bavarian Alps, her father reading her stories before bed. These glimpses of normalcy made the present devastation even more heartbreaking. By August, Miller had made a decision that would define the rest of his life. He could not simply feed Ghazala occasionally. She needed sustained support, protection, and hope for a future. He began inquiring carefully, obliquely about adoption procedures, refugee programs, and possibilities for getting German children to America. What he discovered was discouraging. Official channels were clogged with bureaucracy, and American policy explicitly discouraged any form of permanent relationship between soldiers and German civilians. Moreover, as an unmarried enlisted man, he had virtually no standing to adopt anyone. According to historical records maintained by the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum, the immediate post-war period saw millions of displaced persons across Europe, including an estimated several 100,000 German orphans. Relief organizations struggled to provide basic care, and formal adoption processes were virtually non-existent in the chaos of 1945. Many children simply disappeared into the administrative void, their fates unrecorded and unknown. Miller realized he would have to operate entirely outside official channels. He began documenting everything about Gisela, writing down her full name, birth date, parents' names, her former address, creating a paper trail that might someday help establish her identity if opportunities arose. He also started teaching her more English, reasoning that language skills might improve her prospects regardless of what the future held. The relationship evolved beyond mere charity. Gisela began calling him Uncle Robert, and though he understood the risks of emotional attachment, Miller found himself caring for the child with a paternal intensity that surprised him. He had never married, never had children, and had always assumed military life precluded such possibilities. Now, in the most unlikely circumstances imaginable, he had found something resembling family. The dangers extended beyond military regulations. Frankfurt's streets harbored genuine threats: criminal gangs, desperate refugees willing to do anything for food, and the lingering presence of die-hard Nazi sympathizers who viewed collaboration with Americans as treason. Miller knew that his visits put Gisela at risk. If others discovered she had access to American food, she would become a target for robbery or worse. He taught her to hide the food he brought, to eat discreetly, to share nothing with anyone. Survival lessons that pained him, even as he recognized their necessity. September of 1945 witnessed the first signs of autumn returning to Germany, bringing with it cold winds that whistled through Frankfurt's bombed-out buildings and a growing desperation among the civilian population. The temporary summer shelters, canvas tents, and makeshift lean-tos would not survive winter, and everyone knew that the coming months would test survival in ways that even the war had not. Gisela had managed to find a more permanent hiding place in the basement of a partially collapsed apartment building, sharing the space with 2 other orphan children, but warmth and adequate food remained elusive dreams. Sergeant Miller's unit received orders in mid-September to relocate to a different sector of the American occupation zone, moving northeast to the city of Kassel. The news struck him like a physical blow. For 3 months, he had maintained his secret lifeline to Gisela, and now military bureaucracy threatened to sever it completely. Kassel lay approximately 100 miles from Frankfurt, an impossible distance for regular visits given military restrictions and transportation limitations. He had 48 hours before departure. Miller spent those 2 days in frantic activity. He gathered every bit of food he could acquire, trading away virtually everything he owned: his watch, spare uniforms, even his father's pocket knife that he had carried through the entire war. He accumulated cans of Spam, condensed milk, chocolate bars, crackers, dried beans, and powdered eggs, enough food to sustain Gazella for perhaps 2 months if she rationed carefully. He also obtained a wool blanket, soap, and a pair of boys' boots that were too large but could be stuffed with newspaper. When he found Gazella at their usual meeting place, he saw immediately that she understood something was wrong. Children who had survived what she had survived developed an acute sensitivity to loss. It was written in every line of their being. Miller knelt beside her and explained in his broken German that he had to leave, but would return. He showed her the cache of supplies he had hidden nearby, and made her swear that she would ration it, she would survive, that she would wait for him. The child's response devastated him. She did not cry or protest. Instead, she simply nodded with the terrible resignation of someone who had already lost everything and expected nothing different from the universe. In that moment, Miller made a promise he had no authority or realistic ability to keep. He would come back. He would check on her. He would not abandon her. Gazella looked at him with ancient eyes in a child's face and said in careful English, "I will wait, Uncle Robert." The journey to Kassel took most of a day, and Miller spent it calculating distances, duty schedules, and possibilities. Military personnel could not simply requisition vehicles for personal use, but supply trucks made regular runs between occupied cities. Guards at checkpoints rarely questioned soldiers hitching rides on military transport. If he was careful, creative, and lucky, he might manage trips back to Frankfurt every few weeks. It would be dangerous, exhausting, and potentially career-ending if discovered, but the alternative, abandoning Gazella to starvation, was simply unacceptable. Historical accounts from the National Archives indicate that American military regulations in 1945 strictly controlled soldier movement between occupation zones. Unauthorized travel could result in charges of desertion, particularly if soldiers failed to report for assigned duties. The military bureaucracy, struggling to manage millions of personnel across Europe, maintained rigid controls to prevent chaos and ensure operational readiness. Miller's first weeks in Kassel involved learning his new unit's routines and identifying opportunities. He discovered that supply convoys departed for Frankfurt every Thursday, returning Friday evening. By volunteering for extra duties early in the week, he could sometimes secure Thursday afternoons free. The journey required careful timing, catching the convoy south, spending perhaps 3 hours in Frankfurt, then returning on the same trucks, or finding alternative transport back to Kassel before his absence was noted. His first return trip occurred in early October of 19... He found Gazella thinner than before. The food he had left nearly exhausted despite her attempts to ration it. The 2 other children who shared her basement had died, one from typhus, the other from pneumonia, and Gazella had buried them herself in the rubble. Marking their graves with broken pieces of masonry, she recounted these facts without emotion, her voice flat and distant, and Miller recognized the signs of trauma that he had seen in soldiers after prolonged combat. This child was suffering from wounds no medic could treat. He brought more food, another blanket, and something else, a small notebook and pencil. He encouraged Gazella to write, to keep a journal, to preserve some record of her thoughts and experiences. Writing, he believed, might help her maintain sanity in circumstances that would break most adults. She accepted the gift solemnly, and later he would learn that she filled those pages with drawings of her lost family. Descriptions of her former life, and careful English sentences practicing the language he was teaching her. December of 1945 arrived with brutal cold that turned Frankfurt's ruins into a frozen hellscape. The temperatures plummeted well below freezing, and snow accumulated in drifts that buried rubble and filled basements where orphaned children huddled for shelter. The harsh winter of 1945 to 1946 would become legendary in Germany's post-war history, claiming thousands of lives among the already weakened population. For Gazella Schmidt, now 9 years old, survival became an hour-by-hour struggle against cold and hunger that made death seem almost welcoming. Sergeant Miller had managed 3 more trips to Frankfurt between October and late November, each journey requiring increasingly elaborate deceptions and taking greater risks. His sergeant major had begun questioning his frequent absences, and military police had tightened controls on unauthorized travel following several incidents of soldiers engaging in black market activities. Miller knew he was pushing his luck, but each time he saw Gazella thinner, weaker, more withdrawn, he could not conceive of stopping. The December cold created a crisis. Gazella's basement shelter, barely adequate during warmer months, became deadly when temperatures dropped. She had developed a persistent cough that worried Miller terribly. He recognized it as a potential symptom of pneumonia or tuberculosis, both of which were epidemic among Germany's displaced population. Without proper medical care, warm shelter, and adequate nutrition, she would not survive the winter. He needed to do something more than bring food, needed a fundamental solution. Military hospitals and aid stations served only Allied personnel and authorized refugees, explicitly excluding German civilians. However, Miller had befriended a medic named Corporal James Peterson, a pragmatic young man from Minnesota who had seen enough suffering to question official policies that prioritized ideology over humanity. Miller confided in Peterson about Gazella, showing him a photograph he had taken with a borrowed, camera-haunting image of a skeletal child with enormous dark eyes that seemed to contain all the world's sorrow. Peterson agreed to help, though he made clear the risks they both faced. K. provided Miller with sulfa drugs, cough medicine, vitamins, and most valuable of all, medical advice. He explained how to recognize dangerous symptoms, how to treat minor ailments, and most importantly, how to prevent infections in unsanitary conditions. This information, combined with the medical supplies, gave Miller tools beyond simple food provision. He was becoming not just a benefactor, but a de facto guardian to a child who officially did not exist in his world. According to documentation preserved by the German Historical Museum, the winter of 1945 to 1946 saw mortality rates among German civilians spike dramatically, particularly among children and the elderly. Estimates suggest that over 100,000 Germans died from cold and starvation during those months. Though exact figures remain disputed. The humanitarian crisis was immense, yet Allied policy remained focused on establishing stability and preventing the resurgence of German military capability, rather than immediate civilian relief. Miller's Christmas of 1945 was spent on a desperate mission back to Frankfurt. He had accumulated gifts for Gazella, real coat obtained through complex bartering, new boots that actually fit, canned chicken, chocolate, oranges from the officers' mess, and a small doll he had found in a bombed-out toy store. These items represented weeks of trading, scheming, and saving. But as he made his way through snowy streets to her basement hideout, he wondered if it would be enough. He found Gazella, barely conscious, burning with fever, her cough producing bloody phlegm. The basement was so cold that ice had formed on the walls, and she had wrapped herself in every scrap of fabric available, creating a cocoon that provided minimal insulation. Miller's military training took over, administered sulfa drugs, forced her to drink water mixed with precious powdered milk, and then made the most dangerous decision of his life. He picked her up light as a bundle of sticks, despite her 9 years, and carried her out of the basement. What followed was 4 hours of terror. Miller could not take Gazella to any official American facility, so he sought help from German civilians willing to risk harboring a child connected to an American soldier. He finally found an elderly woman named Frau Hoffman who agreed to shelter Gazella temporarily in exchange for food and coal. The woman's own son had died in Russia, and perhaps she saw in this arrangement a chance to balance some cosmic ledger. For 3 days, Miller stayed near Frankfurt, visiting Gazella multiple times daily, monitoring her fever, administering medicine, and praying to a god he was no longer sure existed. The fever broke on the 3rd day. Gazella woke lucid, weak but alive, and when she saw Miller sitting beside her makeshift bed, she smiled, the first real smile he had ever seen from her. In that moment, whatever abstract doubt he had carried about the risks and the righteousness of his actions dissolved. This child had become his responsibility, his purpose, perhaps even his redemption for all the death and destruction he had witnessed and participated in during the war. He could not save the world, could not undo the horrors that had occurred, but he could save this one small life. February of 1946 brought a slight easing of winter's grip on Germany, though conditions remained desperate throughout the occupied zones. Sergeant Robert Miller had been operating his clandestine support network for Gazella Schmidt for 8 months now, and the strain was showing. He had lost nearly 30 pounds. His uniforms hung loose on his frame. Dark circles under his eyes betrayed chronic exhaustion, from the double life he maintained. Other soldiers assumed he was ill or suffering from combat stress, and their concern was not entirely misplaced. Miller was indeed suffering, though from a burden he had chosen rather than one imposed by war. Frau Hoffmann had continued sheltering Ghazala through the worst of winter, but the arrangement could not last indefinitely. The elderly woman survived on Miller's food contributions, and as spring approached, she would need to present some explanation for the child's presence to neighbors and local authorities. The Allied occupation had begun establishing rudimentary administrative systems, including registration requirements for all German civilians. Gisela existed in a bureaucratic void. No official records survived for her family, and without documentation, she was essentially invisible to both German and American authorities. Miller understood that this invisibility, while dangerous, also provided opportunities. He began researching options more systematically, spending his scarce free time in the military library reading about refugee policies, adoption laws, and immigration procedures. What he discovered was simultaneously encouraging and frustrating. The United States had begun allowing limited immigration of European refugees, including some German children, but the process required sponsorship, documentation, and approval through multiple bureaucratic layers. For an unmarried enlisted soldier to adopt a German orphan seemed virtually impossible. However, Miller also learned about various charitable organizations operating in occupied Germany, religious groups, relief agencies, and humanitarian organizations that worked with displaced children. The most promising was a Catholic charity called Caritas, which operated orphanages and worked to place children with families. Through careful inquiries, Miller made contact with a Caritas representative named Sister Maria Teresa, a pragmatic nun who had seen enough of war's aftermath to prioritize practical solutions over bureaucratic purity. Sister Maria Teresa listened to Miller's story with compassion, but also hard-headed realism. She explained that Caritas operated several orphanages in the American sector where Gisela could receive food, shelter, education, and medical care. However, admission required documentation that Gisela lacked. Moreover, the nun warned that many orphanages were overcrowded, understaffed, and struggling with disease outbreaks. Children died regularly in these institutions, not from malice but from the sheer, overwhelming scale of post-war devastation. Miller made a counterproposal. What if he continued providing food and financial support, while Caritas helped establish documentation for Gisela? He would pay in American dollars, cigarettes, or whatever currency worked for someone to process paperwork, create records, and officially establish Gisela's existence within the system. The nun studied him for a long moment, then agreed to help, though she warned the process would take months and required absolute discretion. If American military authorities discovered an enlisted soldier essentially funding and directing the placement of a German child, the consequences would be severe for everyone involved. Contemporary research published by the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum indicates that the immediate post-war period saw extensive documentation challenges across Germany. Millions of records had been destroyed, either deliberately by fleeing Nazis or collaterally through bombing and combat. Establishing identity for displaced persons often required creative reconstruction of personal histories based on testimony, surviving witnesses, and circumstantial evidence. The bureaucratic chaos created both enormous suffering and occasional opportunities for those willing to navigate gray areas. Through March and April of 1946, Miller's conspiracy of goodwill expanded. Sister Maria Teresa enlisted help from German clerks who could access surviving municipal records. They discovered that while Gisela's family apartment had been destroyed, birth records from Frankfurt City Hall partially survived. With this foundation, they began reconstructing her official existence: birth certificate, school records, documentation of her parents' deaths. Each piece of paper required time, money, and risk. But gradually, Gisela Schmidt transformed from a ghost into a recognized person within post-war Germany's administrative structure. Meanwhile, Miller continued his exhausting routine of secret visits, food smuggling, and constant vigilance against discovery. He had developed an elaborate cover story about attending military education classes in Frankfurt, and his commanding officers, perhaps suspecting something, but choosing not to investigate too closely, generally approved his travel requests. The army was beginning to demobilize, with millions of soldiers desperate to return home, and military discipline had loosened somewhat as the focus shifted from combat operations to occupation administration. Gisela herself was changing. Better nutrition, consistent shelter with Frau Hoffmann, and Miller's unwavering support had allowed her to recover some physical health and emotional stability. She had begun attending informal school classes organized by Caritas, learning alongside other orphan children. Her English improved dramatically, and she spent hours writing in the notebooks Miller provided, documenting her experiences and dreams for the future. She had started calling herself Gisela Miller in her private writings, though neither she nor Robert had dared speak openly about such possibilities. The question of future permanent arrangements haunted Miller constantly. His military service was scheduled to end in December of 1946. He could re-enlist, maintaining his presence in Germany and continuing to support Gisela. Or he could return to Iowa and attempt to bring her to America through official channels, a process that might take years and could easily fail. Either choice involved enormous risks and uncertain outcomes, but doing nothing was not an option. June of 1946 marked a subtle but significant shift in the American occupation of Germany. The initial harsh non-fraternization policies had gradually eroded under the weight of practical reality and simple human compassion. Soldiers were now permitted limited interaction with German civilians. Military government authorities had begun addressing humanitarian concerns more seriously, and the focus was slowly shifting from punishment to reconstruction. For Sergeant Robert Miller, these changes created both opportunities and new anxieties about his secret relationship with Gisela Schmidt. The reconstruction of Gisela's official documentation had been completed through Sister Maria Theresa's network. She now possessed certified birth records, death certificates for her parents, and school transcripts, a complete paper trail that established her identity and orphan status. Caritas had officially registered her as a ward of the church, living in foster placement with Frau Hoffmann, and receiving educational support from Catholic relief programs. On paper at least, Gisela had transformed from an invisible street child into a recognized person within the occupation's administrative structure. Miller's role remained carefully obscured. Official records showed Caritas providing support, with funding from general American charitable donations that many soldiers contributed to. The truth that Miller personally funded most of Gisela's care and had orchestrated her entire integration into the system remained hidden in layers of bureaucratic obfuscation that Sister Maria Theresa had expertly constructed. The nun, pragmatic and experienced in navigating complex systems, understood that some good works required shadows rather than light. However, maintaining secrecy became increasingly difficult as Miller's personal investment deepened. He found himself thinking about Gisela constantly, planning for her future, imagining possibilities that seemed simultaneously beautiful and impossible. Other soldiers noticed his distraction. His closest friend, Corporal David Chen from California, finally confronted him directly, demanding to know what was happening. Exhausted from months of deception, Miller confided the truth. Chen's reaction surprised him. Instead of judgment or warnings about regulations, the corporal simply asked, "What do you need?" Miller learned that Chen, his own family, had been interned during the war simply for being Japanese American. It developed a deep skepticism about official policies that treated people as categories rather than individuals. Within days, Chen had quietly recruited 3 other soldiers who agreed to help, providing additional food contributions, covering for Miller's absences, and creating a small network of supporters who understood they were breaking rules for good reasons. This expansion both relieved and terrified Miller. More helpers meant better support for Gisela, but also increased risk of discovery. Military intelligence had been investigating black market activities and corruption among occupation forces. And any group of soldiers pooling resources and making unauthorized trips could attract unwanted attention. The conspirators needed to be extraordinarily careful, maintaining absolute secrecy while expanding their assistance to the child who had become their collective project. Historical records from the National Archives revealed that, by mid-1946, American military authorities were increasingly concerned about soldiers forming inappropriate attachments to German civilians, particularly relationships involving children that might create adoption complications or financial irregularities. Multiple memoranda from occupation headquarters emphasized strict oversight of soldier-civilian interactions and warned against sentimental decision-making that could complicate military administration or create diplomatic problems. In July of 1946, Miller received devastating news. His unit would be reassigned again, this time to Berlin, nearly 400 miles from Frankfurt. The move was scheduled for September, giving him roughly 2 months to make critical decisions about Gisela's future. Berlin assignment was typically longer term, potentially lasting a year or more, and the distance would make regular visits impossible. He could re-enlist and request to stay in the Frankfurt area. But such requests were rarely granted without compelling official justification, which he certainly could not provide. The crisis forced Miller to confront what he had been avoiding for months. He needed to either find a permanent solution for Gisela's care or attempt something far more radical, bringing her to America. The latter option had seemed purely fantasy, but Chen suggested investigating recent policy changes regarding German orphans. America had begun allowing limited immigration of displaced children, particularly those sponsored by established families or organizations. The process remained bureaucratic and difficult, but it was no longer completely impossible. Miller spent his off-duty hours researching frantically. He wrote letters to his family in Iowa, his mother, 2 sisters, and various cousins, explaining the situation and asking if anyone would be willing to serve as official sponsors for a German orphan. The responses trickled back over several weeks, and while his family expressed sympathy, most were reluctant to commit to sponsoring a child they had never met, from a country they had recently been at war with, based on their son's brother's emotionally charged descriptions. The reality of small-town Iowa prejudices and economic limitations made his request seem unrealistic. His mother's letter, however, offered a different perspective. She wrote that while she could not officially sponsor Gisela, she would welcome the child into their home if Miller could somehow bring her to America. The distinction was subtle, but significant. His family would accept Gisela if she arrived, but would not initiate the bureaucratic process to bring her over. Miller realized this placed the entire burden on him. He would need to find official sponsors, navigate the immigration maze, and create a viable path forward, all while maintaining his military service and keeping the entire operation secret from authorities who would certainly disapprove. Time was running out. September approached with terrifying speed, and Miller had not yet identified a realistic solution. Gisela sensed his anxiety during his visits, though he tried to maintain optimistic encouragement. She had grown to depend on him utterly, and the prospect of another abandonment, an involuntary one, threatened to destroy the fragile emotional recovery she had achieved over the past year. Miller lay awake nights, haunted by the memory of her ancient eyes in a child's face, and the terrible weight of the promise he had made. "I will not abandon you." September of 1946 arrived with autumn colors beginning to paint the German countryside and a sense of urgency that consumed Sergeant Robert Miller completely. His unit's deployment to Berlin was scheduled for the 15th of the month. Leaving him less than 2 weeks to resolve an impossible situation, Gisela Schmidt, now 10 years old, had stabilized physically and emotionally under the consistent care that Miller's support provided. But this stability rested entirely on his continued presence about to be removed by military bureaucracy, indifferent to individual circumstances. Miller had spent August exploring every conceivable option. He had contacted multiple American charitable organizations, written to congressmen whose names he barely recognized, and even attempted to reach military chaplains who might have influence with higher authorities. The responses, when they came, were uniformly discouraging. Immigration policies for German children remained restrictive. Adoption by unmarried soldiers was explicitly prohibited, and the bureaucratic requirements for sponsorship were overwhelming. Each closed door deepened Miller's desperation. Corporal Chen suggested an alternative that Miller had been avoiding contemplating. What if they simply brought Gisela to Berlin with them, hiding her among military dependents? The American sector in Berlin housed thousands of civilian support staff, family members of officers, and various contractors in security was somewhat less rigid than in smaller occupation zones. With proper documentation, which Sister Maria Theresa could potentially provide, Gisela might be able to live quietly in Berlin under protective supervision, while Miller continued his service. The proposal was audacious, illegal, and potentially disastrous if discovered. Smuggling a German civilian into Berlin on military transport violated multiple regulations and could result in court-martial for everyone involved. Yet as Miller weighed the alternatives abandoning Gisela, to an uncertain fate in Frankfurt's overcrowded orphanage system, or attempting this dangerous deception, he found himself seriously considering Chen's plan. The fundamental calculus had not changed since that first day when he gave a starving child a chocolate bar. Regulations were important, but they were not more important than a human life. Sister Maria Theresa listened to the proposal with her characteristic pragmatism. She could create documentation identifying Gazella as a displaced person employed by Catholic Relief Services. Working as a translator and assistant in Berlin programs, such positions existed legitimately, and with proper paperwork, Gazella might pass initial scrutiny. However, the nun warned that sustained deception would be far more difficult. Berlin was crawling with Allied administration officials, and any serious investigation would expose the fiction immediately. Miller decided to take the risk, but with modifications that reduced exposure. Rather than traveling with military convoy, Gazella would journey to Berlin via civilian rail transport, accompanied by a genuine Caritas worker who was relocating to Berlin programs. Miller would arrange housing through contacts in Berlin's civilian sector, keeping Gazella completely separate from military facilities. He would continue financial support and regular visits, but the physical separation would reduce the chances of discovery. It was not ideal, but it extended protection while maintaining plausible deniability. According to historical documentation preserved in the archives of the Catholic Diocese of Berlin, the immediate post-war years saw extensive movement of displaced persons and relief workers throughout occupied Germany. Caritas and similar organizations operated extensive networks supporting orphans, refugees, and impoverished civilians, with minimal oversight from Allied military authorities, who were generally content to let religious charities handle humanitarian challenges they lacked resources to address directly. This administrative confusion created spaces where children like Gazella could exist in bureaucratic gray zones. The logistics required frantic coordination. Miller liquidated virtually all his personal assets, selling everything from his camera to spare uniforms, accumulating funds to support Gazella for several months in Berlin. Chen and the other soldiers contributed what they could, creating a small financial cushion. Sister Maria Theresa prepared documentation and arranged for Sister Catherine, a younger nun relocating to Berlin orphanage work, to escort Gazella on the train journey. Frau Hoffmann, increasingly frail and struggling with her own survival, reluctantly agreed to the plan, understanding that she could not provide long-term care for the child. Miller met with Gazella 3 days before the departure, explaining the plan carefully and ensuring she understood both the opportunities and dangers. The child, who had survived horrors that would break most adults, listened with remarkable composure. She asked only one question: "Will you truly come to Berlin also, Uncle Robert?" Miller promised he would, and this time the promise came with concrete plans rather than desperate hope. He would be stationed in Berlin, would know where she lived, would continue their relationship carefully, secretly, but genuinely. September 12th, 1946, saw Gazella Schmidt board a train at Frankfurt's damaged but functional station. Sitting beside Sister Catherine and carrying a small suitcase containing everything she owned, clothes Miller had provided, her notebooks filled with writings and drawings, and a photograph of her parents that had somehow survived the destruction of her family's apartment. As the train pulled away, Miller watched from a distance, not daring to approach openly, but making silent promises to a child who had become the most important person in his world. 2 days later, Miller's unit departed for Berlin. The journey took most of a day, traveling through devastated landscapes that still bore the scars of recent combat. Miller spent the trip calculating distances, planning visit schedules, and worrying about the 100 things that could go wrong with their improvised plan. Berlin was a divided city under four-power occupation: American, British, French, and Soviet sectors, at different rules, challenges, and dangers. The city itself remained largely ruined, housing was scarce, and tensions between the Western Allies and the Soviets were escalating into what would later be recognized as the opening moves of the Cold War. Upon arrival in Berlin, Miller's first priority was confirming Gazella's safe arrival and establishing contact. It took 2 agonizing days before he located the address where Sister Catherine had placed her a small apartment in the American sector, shared with 3 other displaced children under the nominal supervision of a Caritas volunteer named Frau Weber. The reunion was brief but emotionally intense. Gazella had survived the journey, The documentation had passed initial scrutiny, and she was safe, at least for the moment. November of 1946 found Berlin shivering under early winter cold, as the reality of long-term occupation settled over the divided city. The ruins seemed even more extensive than Frankfurt's entire neighborhoods reduced to rubble. The famous Brandenburg Gate standing isolated amid destruction, and the Reichstag building a burned-out shell symbolizing the Third Reich's apocalyptic end. For Sergeant Robert Miller, now stationed with the military administration headquarters, Berlin represented both new opportunities and heightened dangers for his continued support of Gisela Schmidt. The arrangement in Berlin had survived its first 2 months, but maintaining the deception required constant vigilance. Miller visited Gisela twice weekly, always in civilian clothes obtained through the black market, always varying his routes and timing to avoid patterns that might attract attention. The apartment where she lived with 3 other displaced children, 2 Polish siblings and a Hungarian boy, was administered by Frau Weber, a 60-year-old German woman whose own family had been killed in the final battle for Berlin. She asked few questions about Gisela's American benefactor, content with the food and money Miller provided in exchange for her discreet cooperation. Gisela had begun attending a makeshift school operated by Caritas in the American sector, learning alongside dozens of other displaced children. Her English had improved remarkably, and she was beginning to show the intellectual promise that her education before the war had indicated. As teachers noticed her abilities, which created both pride and anxiety for Milora, exceptional students attracted attention. And attention invited questions about her background and support system. The Cold War was beginning to cast its shadow over Berlin. Relations between the Western Allies and the Soviets had deteriorated dramatically. The city was becoming a front line in an ideological struggle that would define the next 40 years. Movement between sectors was becoming more restricted. American military authorities were intensifying security protocols to prevent espionage and defection. This increased scrutiny made Miller's clandestine activities more dangerous. Any soldier behaving unusually risked investigation by intelligence officers who saw Soviet agents everywhere. Miller's personal situation was also evolving. His enlistment would expire in December, and he faced a decision that would determine Gisela's future as much as his own. He could re-enlist, maintaining his presence in Berlin and continuing to support her. But this would mean years more of secrecy, stress, and the constant risk of discovery. Alternatively, he could return to civilian life and attempt to bring Gisela to America through official channels, a process that remained extremely difficult, but was no longer completely impossible as American policy toward German orphans slowly liberalized. In late November, Miller received unexpected news that would change everything. It's an announcement that the United States would be expanding its displaced persons immigration program. It's potentially allowing up to 200,000 refugees and orphans to enter America over the next several years. The legislation was still being debated in Congress, but military administration officers had been briefed that significant policy changes were imminent. For the first time since he had begun helping Gisela, Miller saw a genuine pathway to a permanent solution. Research documented in the archives of the United States Immigration and Naturalization Service indicates that the Displaced Persons Act, which would be formally passed in June of 1948, began as various legislative proposals in 1946 and 1947. These discussions reflected growing recognition that America had both moral obligations and practical interests in helping resettle European refugees, particularly orphan children who represented no security threat and could be integrated into American society relatively easily. Miller began corresponding with immigration advocacy organizations, including the Hebrew Immigrant Aid Society and Lutheran Social Services, both of which were working to bring displaced children to America. He learned that sponsorship requirements were being relaxed. Somewhat extended family members could potentially sponsor children, and even unrelated individuals might qualify if they could demonstrate financial stability and moral character. Miller's military service, clean record, and farm family background positioned him better than he had realized. However, success required something he had carefully avoided for over a year: officially acknowledging his relationship with Gisela. He would have to formally petition military authorities for permission to sponsor a German orphan, explaining how he had become her de facto guardian and requesting approval to proceed with immigration applications. This meant admitting 2 months of unauthorized fraternization, financial support, and at least technical violations of military regulations. Corporal Chen, who had been promoted to sergeant and remained Miller's closest confidant, helped him think through the implications. The military had 2 faces: the face of rigid regulations and the face of practical accommodation. If Miller approached the right officers, emphasized his honorable service record, and presented his case as humanitarian rather than primarily personal, he might receive official approval rather than punishment. The key was timing and presentation, framing his actions as worthy of commendation rather than discipline. Miller spent 2 weeks preparing his case, gathering documentation about Gisela's situation, obtaining letters of support from Sister Maria Teresa and other Caritas officials, and even securing statements from Frau Weber about the child's circumstances. Compiled everything into a formal petition requesting permission to sponsor Gisela's immigration to the United States, accompanied by a complete confession of his activities over the past 18 months. It was either the bravest or most foolish thing he had ever done, and as he walked the documents to his commanding officer's headquarters on December 6, 1946, his hands shook with fear about the consequences. Colonel Thomas Bradford, his battalion commander, was a career officer who had fought through North Africa, Italy, and France before assuming occupation duties. He was known as fair but strict, a man who valued discipline but also recognized exceptional circumstances. When Miller presented his petition and confessed to the extended deception, Bradford listened without interruption, his expression unreadable. After Miller finished, the colonel asked a single question: "Is this child worth throwing away your military career and possibly facing court-martial?" Miller met his commander's eyes and answered without hesitation, "Sir, she is worth anything." Bradford studied him for a long moment, then picked up a pen and wrote a single word across the petition: "Approved." He added, "This stays between us for now, Sergeant. If your immigration petition succeeds, your actions will be reframed as unofficial humanitarian assistance, which, while irregular, reflects well on American values. If it fails, we'll address the disciplinary implications at that time. I'll get out of my office before I reconsider." Miller walked out in a daze, clutching the approved petition, hardly believing what had just occurred. He had expected anger, punishment, perhaps even arrest. Instead, he had received grudging official sanction for a relationship he had been hiding for 18 months. It was not complete victory. Many challenges remained, and the immigration process could take years, but for the first time, hope seemed grounded in reality rather than desperate fantasy. March of 1947 brought the first hints of spring to Berlin, along with growing political tensions that would soon crystallize into the Berlin blockade and airlift. For Gisela Schmidt and Sergeant Robert Miller, however, the external political drama was secondary to their personal journey through the American Mint. Immigration bureaucracy, a labyrinth of forms, interviews, investigations, and waiting that tested patience and faith in ways that war had not. Miller had been discharged from active military service in January of 1947, but he remained in Berlin as a civilian employee of the military government, working in supply administration. This civilian status actually improved his immigration sponsorship application. He was no longer subject to military regulations about fraternization, and his employment provided the stable income that immigration authorities required of sponsors. He had rented a small apartment in the American sector, living modestly and saving every possible dollar for the expenses that bringing Gisela to America would require. The immigration application process revealed itself to be extraordinarily complex. Gisela needed not only approval from American authorities, but also exit permission from German administration and Allied occupation governments. Each bureaucracy had its own requirements, timelines, and unpredictable delays. Miller learned to navigate the system through a combination of persistence, strategic use of his military contacts, and payments to various officials who controlled crucial documents payments that were technically illegal but practically necessary in post-war Germany's corrupted administrative environment. Sister Maria Theresa continued, providing invaluable assistance, using her Caritas network to obtain documents and navigate Catholic relief organization procedures. The nun had become genuinely invested in Gisella's future, seeing in this one child's potential rescue a small redemption amid the millions of tragedies that could not be resolved. She wrote passionate letters supporting Miller's sponsorship application, describing his character and commitment in terms that would later prove influential, with immigration officials reviewing the case. Gisela herself was thriving in ways that seemed miraculous, given her traumatic history. Now, 11 years old, she attended school regularly, spoke English fluently, with only a slight German accent, and had begun displaying remarkable academic talents, particularly in mathematics and literature. Her teachers sent reports describing an exceptionally bright child who had survived extraordinary circumstances and deserved every opportunity for a successful future. These evaluations became crucial components of the immigration application, demonstrating that Gisela would contribute positively to American society rather than become a burden. However, the process was far from smooth. In April, Miller received devastating news. His initial sponsorship application had been denied. The official reason cited was unclear relationship status. Immigration authorities questioned why an unrelated single man sought to sponsor a German orphan when traditional family adoption channels existed. The denial letter suggested that if Miller were married, or if the sponsorship went through an established adoption agency, the application might receive more favorable consideration. Historical records from the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum indicate that immigration applications in the late 1940s often faced rejection based on concerns about irregular relationships between sponsors and displaced persons. Officials worried about potential exploitation, unclear motives, or situations that might create future social problems. Single men sponsoring unrelated children attracted particular scrutiny, reflecting both legitimate protective concerns and underlying prejudices about appropriate family structures. The denial plunged Miller into despair. He had been so close to a solution, had received official military approval, navigated months of bureaucracy, and now faced rejection based on social conventions rather than any genuine concern about Gisela's welfare. Corporal Chen, still serving in Berlin and watching his friends struggle, suggested an unconventional solution. What if Miller were married? The question was not entirely hypothetical. Chen had noticed that several American Red Cross workers had expressed interest in Miller, who seemed oblivious to female attention while consumed with Gisela's situation. One of these women was Dorothy Harrison, a 32-year-old nurse from Ohio who had come to Berlin with the Red Cross in 1946. She and Miller had become friends, and Dorothy knew about Gisela. Miller had long since abandoned secrecy among the small community of Americans in Berlin who worked on humanitarian issues. Dorothy understood the immigration barriers Miller faced, and in May of 1947, she made a startling proposal. She would marry Miller, providing the family structure that immigration authorities seemed to require if it would help bring Gisela to America. Miller's response was initial rejection. He could not accept such a sacrifice from someone who deserved a genuine marriage based on love rather than bureaucratic convenience. However, Dorothy was remarkably pragmatic about the situation. She had no prospects for marriage in Ohio, enjoyed her work in Germany, and genuinely liked both Miller and Gisela. A marriage of convenience that might evolve into real partnership seemed preferable to returning to small-town Ohio and a life of limited opportunities. She proposed a simple arrangement: marry to satisfy immigration requirements, bring Gisela to America, and then see what developed naturally between them. After weeks of agonized consideration and multiple conversations with Dorothy exploring motivations, expectations, and potential complications, Miller agreed. They were married in a civil ceremony on July 5, 1947, with Chen and Sister Maria Theresa serving as witnesses. The wedding was purely practical, no celebration, no honeymoon. Just legal documentation that transformed Miller from a questionable single male sponsor into a married man with a wife who could serve as mother figure to the orphan they sought to help. The new marriage immediately changed their immigration application status. Miller resubmitted the sponsorship petition in August, now jointly filed by Robert and Dorothy Miller as a married couple seeking to provide home for a war orphan. The application included Dorothy's nursing credentials, her background investigation results from Red Cross employment, and additional letters explaining how she had come to know Gisela and believe in the child's potential. The revised application presented a conventional picture of a military veteran and his nurse wife performing humanitarian service, precisely the narrative that immigration officials preferred. Waiting for the new application's review consumed the fall of 1947. Miller and Dorothy settled into an odd but functional domestic arrangement, living together in his apartment while maintaining separate bedrooms and operating more as business partners than romantic spouses. Dorothy visited Gisela regularly, establishing genuine rapport with the child who initially viewed her with suspicion but gradually came to appreciate having a female mentor who could discuss topics that Miller awkwardly avoided. Gisela understood that Dorothy's appearance in her life was connected to the immigration process, but she also recognized genuine kindness in the woman who was willing to append her life to help a German orphan she barely knew. The three of them began functioning as an unconventional family, bound not by blood or traditional love, but by shared commitment to a child's future and mutual respect for sacrifices each was making to achieve an improbable goal. June of 1948 arrived with momentous news on multiple fronts. The Displaced Persons Act had finally passed the United States Congress, dramatically expanding immigration opportunities for European refugees. Miller received word that his and Dorothy's joint sponsorship application for Gisela had been approved. The child, who had been starving in Frankfurt's ruins 3 years earlier, would be going to America. The approval came with extensive conditions and requirements. Gisela needed medical examinations, additional documentation, security clearances, and arrangements for transportation across the Atlantic. The process would take several more months, but the fundamental barrier had been removed. Immigration officials had reviewed the Miller's application, interviewed both Robert and Dorothy separately, conducted background investigations, and ultimately determined that Gisela would be entering a stable home environment that could provide the support she needed to build a successful life in America. Sister Maria Teresa wept when Miller brought her the news. The nun had worked with hundreds of displaced children. Knowing that most would face uncertain futures in devastated post-war Europe, to see one child, just one, amid so many tragedies, receive a genuine opportunity for escape and rebuilding seemed almost miraculous. She had maintained faith that Miller's extraordinary commitment would eventually succeed, but belief and reality are different experiences, and the confirmation that Gisela would indeed reach America overwhelmed her with gratitude. The summer of 1948 passed in intensive preparation. Gisela underwent medical examinations that revealed she was generally healthy, despite her traumatic history. Though slightly smaller than average for her 12 years permanent evidence of the starvation she had endured, she received vaccinations required for immigration, obtained official German exit documentation, and even acquired her first passport, a document that transformed her from a stateless orphan into a person with official international identity. Miller and Dorothy spent these months planning their return to America.
Wow.
Miller had secured employment with an agricultural supply company in Iowa, using his military service and farming background to obtain a position that would support his new family. Dorothy had been accepted into a nursing position at the county hospital. They would live initially with Miller's mother in the family farmhouse, a modest but adequate arrangement that would allow them to save money while Gisela adjusted to her new country and culture. The political situation in Berlin was deteriorating dramatically. The Soviet Union had initiated a blockade of West Berlin, cutting off ground access and threatening to starve the city into submission to communist control.
Wow.
The Western Allies responded with the Berlin airlift, flying supplies into the city around the clock. But the crisis made clear that Berlin's window for civilian travel was closing. Miller accelerated their departure plans, urgently securing seats on a military transport flight for September. According to documentation preserved by the National Archives, the Berlin airlift of 1948 to 1949 represented one of the most significant humanitarian and logistical operations in military history, delivering over 2 million tons of supplies to blockaded West Berlin through continuous aircraft operations. The crisis marked a defining moment in the emerging Cold War and demonstrated Western determination to resist Soviet expansion. Tens of thousands of civilians were also evacuated during this period, including refugees seeking escape before the situation worsened further. Gisella's final weeks in Berlin were emotionally complex. The city had been her home for nearly 2 years, and despite its devastation, she developed attachments to Frau Weber, the other displaced children in her apartment, and teachers at the Kurita school. Leaving meant abandoning the familiar, even if that familiar included hardship and uncertainty, for a completely unknown future in a foreign country. She was excited but also terrified, and Miller spent hours reassuring her that fear was normal and that they would face whatever came together as family. September 15, 1948, marked the day that changed everything. Miller, Dorothy, and Gisela boarded a C-54 transport aircraft at Tempelhof Airport, part of a flight carrying military personnel and authorized civilians out of the increasingly volatile Berlin situation. Gisela carried a single suitcase containing her possessions clothes. Her notebooks filled with 3 years of writings, photographs, and a small wooden doll that Miller had given her during their second meeting in Frankfurt. Everything she had survived, everything she had lost, everything she hoped for was compressed into that small case, and the hearts of the 2 adults who had committed themselves to her future. The flight to the American zone took 3 hours, followed by additional transport to Frankfurt, then to a port where they would board a ship for the Atlantic crossing. The ship journey took 9 days, and Gisela spent much of it on deck. Watching the ocean and contemplating the impossible distance opening between herself and everything she had known, Miller stood with her often, saying little, simply providing the steady presence that had sustained her through the darkest times. They arrived in New York Harbor on October 1, 1948. As the Statue of Liberty came into view, Gisela turned to Miller and said in careful English, "Uncle Robert, do you remember your promise?" He nodded, remembering that desperate moment in Frankfurt when he had promised a dying child he would not abandon her. "You kept your promise," she said quietly. "Thank you for keeping your promise." The immigration processing at Ellis Island took most of a day. Final interviews, documentation, verification, and official entry into the United States. When the officer stamped Gisela's papers and said, "Welcome to America," Lady Miller felt something inside himself finally relax. A tension he had carried for 3 years suddenly released. They had done it. Against regulations, bureaucracy, distance, and probability, they had done it. The train journey from New York to Iowa took 2 more days, and Gisela stared out the windows at a country that seemed impossibly vast, undamaged and wealthy compared to everything she had known. American cities were intact, farms were productive, and people looked well-fed, in confident, a stark contrast to Europe's ruins and devastation. Miller's mother met them at the station, a sturdy farm woman in her 60s, who took one look at Gisela and immediately wrapped her in a fierce hug, saying, "Welcome home, child. Welcome home." Giselle's adjustment to American life was neither instant nor simple. She struggled with cultural differences, fought nightmares about her past, and sometimes withdrew into dark moods that worried her new family. But Miller and Dorothy provided patient, consistent support, and gradually, month by month, year by year, Gisela began to heal and build a new identity that honored her German origins while embracing American possibilities. She excelled academically, eventually earning a scholarship to the University of Iowa, where she studied mathematics and education. She became a teacher, dedicating her career to helping children who struggled, drawing on her own experiences to connect with students facing difficulties. She married a fellow teacher in 1961, had 2 children, and built a life characterized by quiet determination to create meaning from tragedy. Miller and Dorothy's marriage, which had begun as pragmatic arrangement, evolved into genuine partnership built on mutual respect and shared purpose. They remained together until Dorothy's death in 1983, never regretting the unconventional beginning that had brought them together. Miller lived until 1996, dying at the age of 77 with Gisela, now known as Gisela, Miller Thompson, holding his hand. In the decades that followed, Gisela told her story selectively, sharing it with her children and grandchildren as they grew old enough to understand. She spoke at veterans events and wrote a memoir in the 1980s titled "The Soldier Who Kept His Promise," documenting her experiences and honoring the man who had risked everything. To save a child he had no obligation to help. The book found modest success, resonating with readers who appreciated stories of courage expressed through quiet, persistent compassion rather than dramatic heroics. Sergeant Robert Miller never received official recognition for his actions, no medals, no commendations, no public acknowledgement from military or government authorities. His violation of regulations, though ultimately overlooked, remained officially unacknowledged. But he had something far more valuable. The knowledge that he had saved a life honored his humanity when regulations demanded otherwise. Given a child the future she deserved. For Miller, that was recognition enough. The story of Robert Miller and Gisela Schmidt represents thousands of similar acts of individual courage during the post-war. Period soldiers, relief workers, and ordinary people who saw suffering and responded with compassion despite regulations, convenience, or conventional wisdom, suggesting they should look away. These stories remind us that history's great movements and policies ultimately depend on individual choices made by people who decide that some things, like a starving child's life, matter more than rules, careers, or personal safety. Gisela lived until 2013, dying at age 77, the same age Miller had been when he passed. In her final years, she established a scholarship fund supporting educational opportunities for refugee children, creating a legacy that extended her rescuers' compassion forward into new generations. The fund continues operating today, having helped hundreds of displaced children access education and build stable lives, a ripple effect from one soldier's decision in the ruins of post-war Frankfurt to give a chocolate bar to a starving child and then refuse to walk away.